You want to know a little secret? If you had asked me in late 2022 what my favorite season of Jetlag was, I would have said it was Circumnavigation. I think that the global scale, the cool locations, and the amazing challenges all led me to thinking that this was the strongest of the first few seasons. The rest of the fanbase didn't agree with me. Over time, I started to see why people disliked this season. However, I recently rewatched in preparation for this video, and I gotta say, there are parts of it that still hold up. The game design was flawed, so flawed that one of the teams couldn't even finish, but this game was so close to working. Just to prove it, I'm going to do something I haven't done before, and that's to simulate my reworked game. Special thanks to everyone who helped me, and let's get started. I'm sure a lot of people were surprised to hear that this season was my favorite for a while. Let me defend myself. I have been watching the channel ever since its launch in May 2022 with Connect 4, and I've already been a Wendover and half as interesting fan for years. When I first saw Connect 4, I instantly knew that this was the show for me. When I saw the first episode, I recognized Sam, of course, because he was the host of Wendover, but I didn't know who Ben or Adam was. Yet, their charisma and sense of humor quickly won me over, as did the fact that they were really effective at competing against Sam and Brian. It felt like they deserved the win, but sadly, their boss won instead. So I go straight into Season 2 seeing Ben and Adam as the underdogs. Nowadays, Ben and especially Adam tend to win more than Sam, but you gotta remember, those seasons hadn't happened yet. Watching Ben and Adam finally get their well-deserved win was just amazing to watch. However, I will admit that with time, this positive wore off. Ben and Adam just aren't the underdogs anymore. Another benefit that this season had, and still has, was its scope. Circumnavigating the world, even on planes, is something that most people haven't done, and the game was designed so that players could go anywhere in the world. That being said, this benefit was significantly weakened by the COVID restrictions that were in place in many countries at the time, which ended up causing game design problems that we will discuss in a moment. Still, plenty of interesting cities around the world like Amsterdam, Singapore, and Sydney were featured. You'll notice that these are pretty big and globally connected places, whereas a lot of later seasons of Jetlag would lead players to more smaller and off-the-beaten-path locations. It's kind of incentivized in a game like this, because bigger cities will have better flight selection. The other type of airports that this incentivizes are big tourist destinations, such as Cancun or Fiji. The fact that this season took place primarily in popular locations meant that the challenges could be large in scale as well. If you look at the official list, you'll see things like going bungee jumping, riding 3 miles on roller coasters, catching a national politician on camera, eating at a Michelin-star restaurant, and walking across a country. And unlike other seasons where the challenges were generated in a randomized system, this season had a simple list where participants were allowed to attempt any challenge at any point in the game, provided that the other team hadn't done it first. Not only did this lead to some pretty cool moments, but as the Baggage Claim podcast pointed out, it incentivized teams to plan their routes ahead of time so that they could go to cities where high-value challenges were available. Overall, there are a lot of elements of this game that work. So, what went wrong? I'm gonna feel bad for talking about this, but I kind of have to. One of the most recent completed seasons is Taiwan's Rail Rush. The general consensus of it seems to be that the game was very well designed, but it was brought down by poor gameplay by Sam. Circumnavigation, one of the show's earliest seasons, has a similar problem. If you were to just look at the clips of Ben and Adam playing the game, you'd have a fun, tense race where Adam flew the various cities and tried to do exciting, difficult challenges, and kept at a good pace as they did it. But when you see what Sam was doing at the time, you see some uneven, messy, and questionable gameplay. Going in roughly chronological order, Team Sam's first big mistake was not doing a challenge in Cancun. While going there was actually a brilliant move on Sam's part, both because it allowed him and Joseph to take a cheap charter flight and because it gave them much needed distance to meet the distance requirement, he had a layover while there and didn't use the opportunity to do a challenge. The game had a punishing penalty where players who started in the same location and did multiple challenges would earn much less than the first challenge that they did. Later in the game, Sam and Joseph would be stuck in Amsterdam because they didn't have enough money for a flight that they needed, and they needed to do a lot of challenges to get the budget that they had to have. If they had taken a bit of time in Cancun to do a challenge, even if it wasn't necessarily high value, they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble. They talked about this in the Baggage Claim podcast, but they seemed to focus more on getting across the Atlantic fast and cheap, and they didn't seem to consider whether going slower would help them out in the long run. To complete these challenges, Sam often bent the rules, which some fans saw as cheating, or at least as cheeky. One of the more controversial ones was him completing a challenge to ascend 500 feet by going up and down an artificial hill many times. Also cheeky was his parkour video, and them having fun in Singapore. In Sam's defense, the original intent of the game was to have a Taskmaster-esque element, where players were allowed to bend the rules and meanings of tasks in creative and interesting ways. Finally, in Singapore, Sam decided that the best way to win the game was to gamble their entire trip budget at a casino. They were only able to complete one challenge, and they did it in a cheeky way. Yes, Sam, the audience will yell at you. This is not helped by the fact that they weren't as far behind Ben and Adam as they thought. Badham only finished the game in under 93 hours. Sam probably could have kept going, but instead, he gambled the budget away and lost the season. Okay, so let's imagine that Sam and Joseph played the game similar to how Ben and Adam played it. They kept a reasonable pace of travel and managed to at least make it past Singapore. What would need to be fixed then? As mentioned before, this game was played when a lot of COVID restrictions were still in place, limiting its potential. While there were plenty of flights between the Americas and Europe, there weren't as many countries open in Asia for players. This created a bottleneck. So already, if this game were being played now, many more countries would be available for transit. Except that leads to the next problem. To play this game, the teams had to bend or break immigration law. If they were to repeat this game, with the channel much more well established, they'd either have to break the law of multiple countries and risk having lifelong immigration issues, or alternatively, they can apply for and get a lot of work visas and filming permits, which would certainly add a lot of expenses to the budget. I'm gonna go with option 2 for the purposes of our reconfiguration. We're gonna just assume that some big streaming service has commissioned a season and offered a lot of cash. What now? Even with a lot of cash, there's still the legal headache of getting permission to do the show in every single possible country they could go to, which is why we're not even gonna bother trying. As of June 2026, we know that the crew has experience filming in these locations, and presumably getting the right to do so. The United States, Canada, the Schengen area, the Common Travel Area, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand. Notice that Mexico, Singapore, and Fiji weren't included, since they were only featured in Season 2. For now. If it were only these countries on the game board, we could still create a functioning game. It would still have a bit of the bottleneck issue, and it would skip over a large part of Asia, an issue I'll discuss in a moment, but there's enough optionality and enough geography to give us a lot of flexibility. And since they'll presumably go to more different places and learn about new visa requirements, this list will only grow over time. And this is all assuming that there aren't countries that they will apply to film in even without having filmed there before in a previous season. Now, for the purposes of this simulation, I'm going to keep the countries available for play strictly to the aforementioned list. I'm sure there are more places where it would be practical to film in, but I'm not adding them yet. If you want to see how the game would work with them in, simulate them in your own time. If you listen to one of the earliest layovers, they discuss how they actually once considered doing a how many countries on Earth can you visit game. This is a lot trickier than it looks, because they'd have to draw the line between where they could and could not visit.
There is a line in terms of kind of what country we can go to practically and safely for these games. And it gets very awkward when you have to define that line in the context of a game.
And to better show this, let's do so through a simulation. When players start the game in Denver, they have to fly to the East Coast. They can go to Canada or the United States, but would Mexico be acceptable? Sam and Joseph visited Cancun back in 2022 during the game, so it's not out of the question, but there are parts of Mexico that are very unsafe for travelers. The good news is that from the North American East Coast, there are many flights to Europe. But after Europe, where do you go? Maybe you'd like to go to India, which is the world's most populous country and one of the largest air markets in the world. However, it's legally difficult to film there. It's not an option. We could go over a little east to Thailand, but statements that the players might have said publicly would have them risking prison time. Same goes for China. We could always go a little west. Dubai has one of the largest airports in the world, as does Doha and Istanbul. There are airlines here that take advantage of the region's geography to connect Europe and Asia. However, this leads to a more subjective, but no less real problem. Many airports in this region are in countries with terrible human rights records, and they're bad enough that they could generate some real backlash. Imagine, for example, if they visited Saudi Arabia with its authoritarian oppression of women and queer people, as well as its funding of war in Yemen. Or if they flew through Tel Aviv as Israel commits apartheid and genocide against Palestine. What about the infamous abuse and enslavement of migrant workers in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar? Visiting any one of these places will get backlash. Now, admittedly, Dubai and Doha were considered as potential stops in Season 2, so they're not completely out of the question. That doesn't mean that people won't get upset if the game incentivizes players to go to either place. This leaves the most realistic option to be going straight from Europe to East Asia, which was exactly what both teams ended up doing in Season 2. And again, they have since filmed locations in 3 countries in East Asia, plus Australia, all of which have flight connections from Europe. Is it necessarily enough flight optionality? Maybe not, but it's probably roughly identical to the COVID bottleneck in 2022, just with a few countries swapped. And again, there are probably a few countries that could be added to this list. In fact, there's probably a few where a season like Circumnavigation is the most realistic chance for them to even be on the show due to their lack of good public transit. I could see the Philippines or Mongolia being fun additions to the region. However, for the purposes of our simulation, we're gonna assume that only the places that have previously been visited are on the table. Once we get through the bottleneck, we got the Pacific Ocean ahead of us, and chances are teams will need to be a little inefficient to get across to meet the minimum distance needed for it to be official. This is actually something one of my playtesters pointed out. There's actually a decent amount of options here, because players can fly not just between Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, but also Hawaii, Guam, and the Compact of Free Association states. Granted, that last one doesn't open that much up, but the island hopper route is pretty cool. If there's a problem in this region of the world, it's that while there are some island nations in the Pacific that could potentially be used in piercing together routes, most have very few flights and limited flexibility. You could probably go through Fiji or even Tahiti, but the options are limited. Honolulu would probably be the best stop for mid-ocean connectivity. Still, this would be a challenging part of the board to get through. Yes, even if we assume that they're only playing in countries or border zones that they have previously visited, this game is still possible. It'd probably be very expensive, though there are some countries that have cheaper and easier restrictions to clear, but it is possible. So what else is wrong with the game? Circumnavigation has a pretty interesting challenge generation system in that there isn't really any. As mentioned before, there is a list of challenges that teams are given and can be played at any point in the game. However, while teams could use this to plan ahead or even to screw opponents, it perhaps made the game too simple. I thought about how the game could be fixed, and the answer was to base it off of Arctic Escape. They said on the layover that Arctic Escape was an improvement on Circumnavigation's basic system, so I tried to fix the game by using Season 8's mechanics for my simulation. Besides, we know that planning ahead is still possible in a game like that, as Michelle showed us with her spreadsheets. Since I'm going to be doing the simulation off of this, I figured I'd show you the tickets I used, which were mainly a combination of Season 2 and Season 8's challenges. The main difference that I made was attaching each ticket to a destination. usually in other countries, so that the next moves would feel natural while still giving a lot of options. This probably is as good a time as any to talk about the onward flight issues. Every time a team crossed a border checkpoint, they needed to show that they had a flight that went to another country, to show that they intended to leave eventually, in the original game. In the version of the game that was played in Season 2, the onward flight to a second destination had to be booked by the time the players landed in their first destination, and it had to come out of the trip budget. I'm going to agree with the Baggage Claim podcast that this should not have been the case. Since we're doing an Arctic Escape style game, I'm not going to require players have a second card used to book their next flight. I'm instead going to have the onward flight be a behind the scenes issue. As an example, let's say the teams are flying from North America to Europe. Rather than needing to have their onward ticket booked by the time they're in air, I'm just going to have the teams book tickets off camera back to the United States that leave in approximately a week from the game day. I did 4 simulations of the game. 2 of these simulations followed the original version of the game, and the other 2 followed my reworked version. First of all, it wasn't easy to do these games at all. There were so many factors to keep track of, and it would get very confusing to keep track of everything, and this was my first time doing something like this. Second of all, special thanks to the 5 players who participated. I really appreciate all of your hard work, and I hope you enjoyed playing with me. Anyways, it turns out the crew is right that you can learn a lot through simulation, so let's see what they can tell us. This game begins at Denver Union Station on Monday, June 22nd, 2026 at 5 a.m. Rather than going directly to the airport, both players do challenges in Denver. Jelly catches a fish, while this guy eats a meal and gets drunk. Jelly flies to Cancun, while this guy flies to Dallas. In Cancun, Jelly eats at a Michelin star restaurant, while this guy rides 3 miles on a roller coaster at Six Flags over Texas. This guy flies to London, while Jelly flies to Madrid. This guy did the pastry mile before going up to Luton Airport and leaving for Rome. Meanwhile, Jelly does the sandcastle challenge and picks up trash in Madrid. This guy goes up to the Vatican and walks across it, finishing that challenge, and he then does paintball. He takes a long flight to Seoul, and he lands right before the game's rest period. The game restarts on Thursday, June 25th at 4 p.m. Seoul time. He goes bungee jumping and then takes a flight to Sydney. He then flies to Los Angeles and then finally back to Denver, getting back at the flagpole at 11:54 a.m. on Friday, June 22nd, 2026, Denver time. You might have noticed that I stopped talking about what Jelly did after a while. She unfortunately got stranded and was unable to complete the game, much like how Sam and Joseph got stuck in Singapore. While I still think my original point stands that Sam didn't play the game well, I also think this playthrough shows that the game is harder to play than it looks, and players who aren't fast enough can fall behind. This game begins at Denver Union Station on Monday, June 22nd, 2026 at 5 a.m. Like the last playthrough, both Jeb and Sri do challenges before taking their flights. Jeb flies to Cancun and gets drunk, while Sri flies to New York and visits 5 attractions and watches a soccer game. Jeb flies from Cancun to Madrid, while Sri flies from New York to Paris. In Madrid, Jeb earns a lot of money doing the go-kart challenge, before leaving for Istanbul. In Paris, Sri does 2 challenges before he leaves on a flight, also to Istanbul. Jeb leaves one of Istanbul's airports, takes a 1-hour drive to the other one, and stops to do the piggyback ride along the way, and he arrives at the same airport where Sri happens to be. To make things more awkward, both Sri and Jeb take the same flight, TK68, leaving Istanbul at 2 a.m. for Bangkok, Thailand, which lands not long before the rest period. The next day, Jeb goes bungee jumping while Sri does the roller coaster challenge. Both teams then take a taxi to the Patpong night market, and they do challenges within walking distance of each other. And then they both go to the airport. Jeb leaves on a flight to Seoul, while Sri leaves on a flight to Melbourne. Sri does the highly valuable kangaroo challenge before flying back to Singapore to get some distance. Jeb flies to Seoul, does a challenge, and then goes back to the airport. Sri then flies from Singapore to Los Angeles, while Jeb flies from Seoul to Seattle to Chicago. Both teams fly back to Denver, but Jeb arrives at 1:06 a.m. on Saturday, June 27th, whereas Sri arrives several hours later at 9:21 a.m. Both of these teams did manage to make it around the world, but the accumulating distance was a challenge. As one of the other players mentioned, it's not easy to hit the roughly 36,000 kilometers needed. The other noticeable thing about this simulation is how the two teams converged with each other around the middle. In Season 2, the teams almost ran into each other in Singapore. In this game, the two competitors go as far as to take the same flight. We talked earlier in the video about how there was a bottleneck in Asia when the game was originally played. I did tell the players they could pretend COVID restrictions weren't in place for the purposes of the game, but it seems like even then, players jumped over most of the Asian continent. There seems to be some kind of incentive to skip India, which, to be fair, might save them a legal headache if they ever redesign the game. Yes, even when I give players nearly unlimited freedom to take whatever cheap flight they can take, they still seem drawn to some countries over others. It's finally time to see how my revised version of the game plays out. On Monday, June 29th at 6 a.m. at Denver Union Station, these 4 cards pop up. The cards, again, are a mix of Arctic Escape and Circumnavigation, which allowed for some fun jokes. For example, instead of having the drunk, not high card go to Colorado, I had it go to the Netherlands. Unfortunately, the game crashes almost immediately. Thomas starts the game by doing the drunk mile, and this guy does the Florida Man challenge. However, Thomas then does the Milwaukee and flies to Milwaukee, and it turns out keeping that card in the game was a bad idea, because there are no flights to Canada or Europe from Milwaukee. I even got feedback on how tough this leg was, and I basically had to do an emergency patch to keep the game going. One edit I made to this version of the game that I didn't mention yet was that I had 2 rest periods. Since the season and the previous simulations basically had 3 phases, I set it up so that the 3 phases would be etched into the game's structure, with the first one covering Denver to Europe, the second covering Europe to East Asia, and the third covering East Asia across the Pacific and back to Denver. In Europe, this guy is in Madrid and Thomas is in Amsterdam, and at the beginning of Phase 2, these 4 cards flop. After this guy gets drunk, the very powerful go-kart ticket flops. Thomas claims the ticket, and another infamous challenge, Catch a Fish, pops up. This guy then does 2 challenges, and both teams fly to Asia, with this guy going to Seoul and Thomas flying to Tokyo. One of the problems with doing a game like this is the lack of optionality. Much like how there often weren't good options in Season 18, video coming soon by the way, the fact that there's a limited amount of options available at one time makes things more difficult, especially since each ticket had intended countries meant for them. As an example, let's say you need some distance and decided to go to Oceania, but you only had New Zealand as an option and not Australia. All of a sudden, you have less options and might have to take longer to wait for the right flight. In conclusion, you want to make the game more difficult? Well, give players even less challenges to do. Unlike the other simulation for Scenario 2, this one starts a lot more smoothly. The 4 tickets that flop up at Denver Union Station are contributing to a waterfall, stealing a Muffler Man's identity, doing Canadian trivia, and the Canada wildcard. Jeb and Sri both go for the Canadian trivia ticket, and Jeb wins it. Jeb does the parkour and the Muffler Man challenge. Sri does the waterfall challenge and climbs 500 feet, getting him tickets to both Iceland and to Switzerland, while Jeb flies to Canada. So far, it seems to be going alright. Sri also gets the drunk mile ticket, and then he flies to Iceland and then to the Netherlands. Jeb watches a sports game in Toronto and then flies to London. Sri also manages to get a steal before the first rest period starts. When Phase 2 starts in Europe, the 4 tickets that flop are submerging yourself in cold water, eating a meal in a municipality with a population under 1,000, capturing a national politician on camera, and taking a photo of 5 landmarks. Eventually, the 2 teams make it to Asia. They do continue on into Phase 3, but to be honest, I ended both of the simulations of Scenario 2 early. It's my own fault for being disorganized, but I did feel like the gameplay in the first half shows that the game is possible. it just has a good chance of breaking, which, to be fair, the original game did too. So, what did we learn today? We learned that game design is hard, and that even a game with flaws like the original Circumnavigation still took a lot of thought to make work. While the original game did have flaws, I feel like analyzing it and playing it digitally allowed me to see not only that it was close to being more loved, but also that there was a lot to like in it. Anyways, this isn't the only simulation we're doing. Come back next time.